At the mall, she overheard the mistress telling a friend about her husband. The friends had no idea that the wife was her. Without saying anything, she went to the movie theater where they were supposed to have a date, and what happened in front of everyone. The afternoon light in Miami filtered through the mall's skylights, creating an atmosphere of luxury and calm. For Savannah, stepping through the glass doors of Elegance Lingerie, her favorite boutique, was like entering a sanctuary. The air was scented with a subtle fragrance of vanilla and jasmine, and the quiet was broken only by the soft rustle of silk and the gentle clink of hangers. There, surrounded by delicate laces and satins that promised secrets, she wasn't just James's wife, Emily's mum, or the retired accountant who organized her life with spreadsheet precision. There she was simply Savannah, a woman. She ran her fingers over a black chantilly lace bodice, feeling the intricate texture under her fingertips. It wasn't for her, it was too bold, almost dramatic. Her plan called for something different, something that whispered elegance rather than shouted for attention. Her goal was rediscovery, not reinvention. A discreet smile, hiding a hint of nervousness and a lot of hope, touched her lips. The plan. The plan had been maturing in her mind for weeks, a small sprout of hope that she watered in silence. The Florida Keys. The name alone evoked salty breezes, the rhythmic sound of waves and images of palm trees bending against a blue sky. It was the perfect setting. They hadn't taken a trip like that, just the two of them, in ages. Maybe not since Emily, their only daughter, decided to move out to be closer to college. Life, with its relentless succession of responsibilities and routines, had the power to erode the landscape of a marriage. First, it was the demands of a young child, then the worries of teenage years, the college choice. And when the nest finally emptied, a new kind of routine settled in, more subtle but equally dangerous. The predictable comfort. Savannah loved James. That love was the foundation of her existence, an unshakable rock. He was her safe harbor, her confidant, the man with whom she could be completely vulnerable. But the passion, that electricity that made her heart stumble, had become a distant memory. Nights were filled with the blue glow of the TV or the light from their phones, each in their own digital world. Conversations revolved around investments, their aging parents' health, updates from Emily. They were important talks, of course, the mortar that kept the marriage structure standing. But where were the whispers? Where were the lingering looks across the dinner table, the hands seeking each other under the cloth, the kisses that weren't just a greeting, but the prelude to something more? She remembered the beginning. James, with his easy smile and a way of looking at her that made her feel like the only woman in the world. They were insatiable. They stole weekends at cheap motels along the coast, made love on rainy nights with thunder as the soundtrack, exchanged passionate notes that she still kept in a cedar box. Passion was the driving force, the energy that propelled them. When did that energy start to fade? There wasn't a specific day, a cataclysmic event. It was a slow fade, like a sunset that, when you notice, has already given way to night. The blame, she knew, wasn't just his. She had also let herself fall into the trap of habit. She traded silk nightgowns for comfortable cotton pajamas. She let the exhaustion of daily life win over desire. Sometimes she looked at the man sleeping beside her, his serene face marked by time's lines, and felt a wave of tenderness so overwhelming it hurt. She loved every inch of that man, but she wanted to desire the husband she loved, and more than anything, she wanted to feel desired by him. That's why the plan for the Florida Keys was born. It was a deliberate attempt to break the spell of routine, to create a sacred space, away from everything and everyone, where they could reconnect not just as life partners, but as lovers. And the lingerie. The lingerie was the centerpiece of that ritual. It was the symbol of her intention. Her eyes landed on a set in a deep burgundy, almost the color of her favorite Cabernet. The silk was smooth, cool to the touch, and the lace adorning it was delicate with a floral pattern that looked hand-painted. It was perfect, elegant, sensual, but not vulgar. It was a piece that spoke the language of maturity, of the self-confidence of a woman who knew her own body and her own worth. She took it to the fitting room, a spacious cubicle with plush carpeting and flattering lighting. As she undressed, she looked at her reflection in the mirror. She saw the body that had given birth to her beloved daughter, that had endured sleepless nights, that had carried the weight of worries and celebrated countless joys. It wasn't the body of a 20-year-old, and she didn't want it to be. It was her body, the map of her life at the peak of her 42 years. And in that moment, wearing that piece that seemed molded for her, she felt incredibly beautiful, powerful. The woman in the mirror wasn't a wife trying to spice up her marriage. She was a goddess reclaiming her temple. A flush of excitement rose to her face. She imagined James's expression, the initial surprise, followed by that gleam in his eyes she knew so well, the awakening of desire she longed to provoke. The trip was already coming to life in her mind. Dinner by candlelight, the wine, the easy-flowing conversation, the laughter. And then in the quiet of the room, just the sound of the ocean and the rediscovery of their bodies. With a light heart and her decision made, she left the fitting room. The boutique remained serene, an oasis amid the mall's bustle. She felt rejuvenated, as if the simple purchase of that lingerie had already blown away some of the dust that had accumulated on their passion. She was ready to take the first step, ready to fight for the magic. While walking toward the register, feeling the soft fabric in her hands, a certainty filled her. No matter how comfortable and secure the routine was, love needed adventure. It needed surprise. It needed moments that broke the monotony and reminded the couple why they had chosen each other in the first place. And she would do her part. She was willing to light the first spark. Little did she know that, in a few minutes, it wouldn't be a spark she found, but an explosion. An explosion that threatened to consume not just her plans, but the very foundation on which her entire life had been built. The air was about to change, and the scent of vanilla would be replaced by the smell of a devastating truth. With the burgundy set already chosen, Savannah felt a wave of confidence so potent that she decided not to stop there. If she was going to create an unforgettable weekend, it might as well be complete. Maybe a second piece, something lighter, a silk baby doll for breakfast on the balcony of the resort overlooking the sea. The idea made her smile. She turned back to the racks, her heart light, feeling almost like a teenager planning her first date. She was so immersed in her thoughts, imagining the taste of coffee and the warmth of the morning sun on her skin, that she almost didn't notice the sudden change in the boutique's atmosphere. It was the sound that pulled her from her reverie. A loud, shrill laugh that shattered the velvety peace like a wine glass crashing to the floor. Two young women entered the store with the energy of a small tornado. They were a blur of long hair, skinny jeans, and self-assurance. The one laughing the loudest, a brunette with expansive gestures, seemed to treat the entire store as her personal stage. The other, a more reserved blonde, followed like a sidekick, laughing in agreement. Immediately all eyes, from the few customers to the saleswoman, turned to them. Savannah felt a pang of irritation at the disruption of her peace, but she quickly replaced it with a bittersweet nostalgia. She remembered herself and her friends at that age, full of certainties with their whole lives ahead, sharing secrets out loud as if the world were deaf to them. A discreet sigh escaped her lips. Time, indeed, was a relentless sculptor, softening the edges of youth and turning noisy passion into silent affection. She tried to ignore them and focus on her search, sliding her fingers over a delicate ivory silk robe. But the voice of the young brunette was impossible to avoid. It was an animated monologue, directed at her friend but projected for anyone who cared to listen. "You have no idea, girl, he finally pulled it off. Movie tonight with me, then the hotel I picked. That one with the rooftop pool, you know? And the best part, the whole night. No curfew." Each word was punctuated by a gesture, a hair flip, a triumphant look. Savannah couldn't help but smile to herself. The excitement was contagious. It reminded her of James, early in their dating days, planning surprises, the delicious anxiety before a meet-up. They had been like that too, hungry for each other, counting the minutes. Their passion had been a spectacle, a fire everyone could see. Where was that fire now? The question lingered in her mind, but she pushed it away. This wasn't the time for melancholy. She was there precisely to buy the matches and gasoline to reignite the flame. She was about to grab the ivory robe to try on when the next sentence from the young woman hit her like a bucket of ice water. "And it's the first time we'll actually sleep cuddled up," the girl said, lowering her voice a notch but still perfectly audible, in a conspiratorial and victorious tone. "Because he's married." Savannah's smile froze. The silk robe suddenly felt heavy in her hands. She glanced discreetly in their direction. The friend widened her eyes, a mix of shock and admiration. The brunette shrugged, a smug smile on her face. An immediate unease settled in Savannah's stomach. The store's air seemed denser, and the vanilla scent suddenly cloying. A quick and harsh judgment formed in her mind. She felt a wave of solidarity for this anonymous wife, a woman who, like her, was probably at home or work, living her life, maybe even planning something for her husband, completely unaware of the betrayal being celebrated openly in a luxury store. What kind of woman took pride in building her happiness on another woman's potential ruin? She forced herself to look away, placing the robe back on the rack with a care she didn't feel. It wasn't her business. It was ugly. It was sad. But it wasn't her problem. She had her own marriage to nurture, her own weekend to save. She tried to refocus, searching for another piece, anything to distract her from that toxic conversation. But it was like trying to ignore a siren right outside her window. The young women's conversation continued, now in a slightly lower tone, but the words floated to Savannah, fragments of a sordid plan that stained the boutique's atmosphere. She felt like an intruder, an unwilling listener to an emotional crime in progress. A strong desire to pay for her purchase and flee grew inside her. She wanted to return to the safety of her world, to her plans, to the idealized image of her weekend. But fate, with its perverse sense of humor, wasn't done yet. Savannah didn't know it, but she wasn't just a casual listener. She was in the front row at the epicenter of an earthquake about to strike. Suddenly, the sharp, modern ring of a cell phone cut through the air. It was the brunette's. She answered with rehearsed speed, her smug smile turning into an expression of sugary sweetness. "Hey, baby," she said, her voice now a seductive coo. Savannah rolled her eyes discreetly, feeling her stomach churn. She was determined to head to the register, pay and leave. Enough was enough. She took a step in that direction, the bag with the burgundy set in hand. But the next word from the girl's mouth paralyzed her, rooting her feet to the store's soft carpet. "Ah, so glad you called, James. I was already missing you." James. The name echoed in Savannah's mind, ricocheting off the walls of her skull. James. It wasn't a John, a Mike, a Peter. It was uncommon, almost unique in her social circle. The air seemed to escape her lungs. A wave of icy cold climbed her spine, raising goosebumps on her arms. Her heart, which had beaten lightly with anticipation, gave a violent, painful stumble. "No," she thought, the word screaming in her mind. It can't be. A rational part of her brain immediately kicked in, trying to contain the rising panic. "Calm down, Savannah. It's a coincidence. Miami's a big city. How many Jameses are out there? It's just a name. A stupid, cruel coincidence." She repeated it to herself like a mantra, a desperate prayer, and stayed still, pretending to examine a random nightgown, but her entire existence was focused on the conversation happening a few feet away. The young woman kept talking, and each word was a nail hammered into the coffin of Savannah's denial. "So everything's set for later. You managed to, get away?" the girl asked, with a complicit giggle. There was a pause as she listened to the response on the other end. Savannah held her breath, the silence from the other side deafening in her imagination. And then the young woman repeated the information, as if to confirm, her voice loud and clear, full of an enthusiasm that was pure torture for Savannah. "Ah, perfect. So you told her you had that super important meeting in Orlando, and you'd only be back tomorrow morning?" The ground vanished. The boutique's walls seemed to curve over Savannah. The soft lights became blinding, and the vanilla scent turned suffocating. The phrase, that exact phrase, it was a perfect echo, a carbon copy of the conversation she'd had with her own husband that same morning, in their kitchen. The scene flashed back with brutal clarity. James, already dressed for work, adjusting his tie, giving her a hurried kiss on the forehead. "Babe, a last-minute meeting popped up in Orlando with that new client." Gotta go this afternoon and probably won't be back till tomorrow morning, okay? Boring stuff, but unavoidable. The same words, the same city, the same lie. The name coincidence was already a blow. The repeated excuse was a death sentence. The probability of it all being a fluke was so infinitesimal, so astronomically impossible, that the idea crumbled to dust. The young woman on the other side of the store gave a little jump of joy, a childish squeal that contrasted with the sordidness of the situation. "That means we'll have the whole night together? Oh, awesome!" she celebrated, hugging her friend, who laughed at the reaction. For Savannah, there was no laughter. There was only the sound of her world shattering into 1,000 pieces. Her heart didn't race. It seemed to stop for a moment and then restart beating heavily, dully, pumping ice and pain through her veins. The woman who planned a romantic weekend in the Florida Keys died there, among racks of silk and lace. In her place, another was born. A woman with an abyss opening beneath her feet and a terrifying question echoing in the void. What would she do now? A primal impulse overtook her. Flee. Run out of that store, away from that conversation, from that unbearable truth. Run home, hide under the covers, and pretend none of it had happened. But another feeling, stronger and colder, began to rise in her throat, choking the panic. Rage. A clear, cutting rage that returned control to her limbs. With a brusque, almost violent movement, she turned and marched to the counter. The saleswoman, who had been watching her curiously, smiled, ready to ring up the purchase. Savannah simply dumped everything she was going to buy on the polished marble. The sound was sharp, final. "Change my mind," she said, her voice coming out firmer than she expected, a thread of normalcy amid the internal chaos. Without looking back, without waiting for a response, she walked out of the store. Each step was heavy, as if she were walking on the ocean floor. As she crossed the door, the mall's noise hit her full force. The conversations, the background music, the sound of hurried footsteps. It was the sound of a world that kept turning, indifferent to the fact that hers had just stopped. She paused near a pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs. Dazed. Doubt and certainty waged a cruel battle in her mind. It can't be him, not my James. But the cold, implacable voice of reason whispered, what if it is? The coincidence was too grotesque, too specific to ignore. Living with that doubt would be torture, a slow poison corroding her soul day by day. She couldn't suffer in vain based on a suspicion. She needed to know. She needed the truth, no matter how devastating. Breathing deeply, she made a decision. The woman who planned romantic surprises gave way to a strategist. The pain gave way to an icy determination. She wouldn't confront, wouldn't yell, wouldn't make a scene. She would investigate. She would gather the evidence piece by piece until no shadow of doubt remained. Using the invisibility that a middle-aged woman in a crowd provided as disguise, she sat on a bench in a way that allowed her to see the entrance to Elegance Lingerie. Her heart still beat erratically, but now it was the adrenaline of the hunt, not the panic of the prey. Minutes later, which felt like an eternity, the two young women emerged from the store laughing with a small bag in hand. The possible mistress. The word now had a face, a body, a voice. Savannah felt a wave of repulsion so intense she had to lean on the pillar. Keeping a safe distance, she began to follow them. It was a surreal sensation, like watching a suspense movie, but she was the protagonist. The two walked leisurely through the mall corridor, window shopping, oblivious to the shadow pursuing them. Finally, they entered a charming cafe with outdoor tables in the main walkway. Savannah waited a moment, the time needed for them to settle and order. Then, with a calm that surprised her, she entered the cafe. She chose a small corner table, slightly behind them, but with a perfect angle to hear. She picked up the menu and held it up, using it as a shield to hide her face, her eyes fixed over the edge, alert to every gesture, every word. The coffee was ordered. The conversation resumed. And there, seated a few feet from the woman talking about her husband, Savannah prepared for the horror. She was about to hear the details, the intimacies, the lies. She was about to get the confirmation she sought. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her bones, that each word would be a stab to her heart. But she needed to hear. She needed to know the full extent of the abyss she was about to fall into. The waiter approached Savannah's table. She ordered an espresso without even looking at the man, her voice a low murmur, her eyes fixed over the trembling menu in her hands. The cafe's hum, the parallel conversations, the clink of cups, all became distant background noise. Her universe had shrunk, focusing with laser intensity on the table next to her. The two young women had already received their frothy lattes. The friend, with wide eyes full of curiosity, leaned forward and asked in a conspiratorial whisper, "But what about his wife? Does he talk about her?" Savannah felt her blood turn cold. It was the question she herself would ask, the one she feared most. She gripped the menu's edge so hard her knuckles turned white. The mistress, the young woman called by James's name, took a sip of her coffee and smiled, a smile of superiority, of someone holding a delicious secret. "Talk? Girl, he opens up completely to me," she boasted, her voice full of cruel pride. "He says the marriage ended ages ago, that it's just for show." The first stab. Savannah felt the impact in the middle of her chest, a physical, sharp pain that stole her breath. For show. The decades of companionship, the shared laughs, the future plans, the trip to the Florida Keys she was planning with such care. All just for show? The young woman continued, savoring each word, each revelation that placed her at the center of that man's universe. "He says she's let herself go, you know. Doesn't dress up anymore, just lounges around and only cares about the daughter who's already living on her own. That they don't even sleep in the same bed, that he crashes in the guest room for some peace." The second stab, deeper, more vicious. Savannah looked at herself, at her well-tailored linen pants, the silk blouse, the care she'd always taken with her appearance. She remembered the nights when James said he'd read late in the other room, so as not to disturb her with the light, an excuse she'd always accepted in her blind trust. The image the mistress painted was of a stranger, a grotesque and humiliating caricature, and the worst part was knowing that was the image James, her James, was selling to justify his betrayal. The waiter placed the small espresso on Savannah's table. She didn't even notice. Her lips were dry and she bit them hard, the metallic taste of blood mixing with the bitterness rising in her throat. She needed to contain the sob threatening to escape. Not there, not in front of them. But the torture wasn't over. The friend asked, "But if it's so bad, why doesn't he just divorce her already?" And then came the final blow, the stab that not only wounded but twisted the blade in the wound. The mistress lowered her tone, adopting an expression of false compassion. "Ah, girl, that's the thing. He can't, not now. He told me she has a really serious health issue." She paused dramatically, ensuring her one-person audience's full attention. "He feels sorry for her. Said he feels trapped, that he wouldn't have the heart to abandon her in that state, but that between them there's nothing left. It's just care, an obligation." A serious health issue? Savannah was perfectly healthy. The lie was so absurd, so calculated, that nausea overtook her. He wasn't just cheating on her, he was assassinating her image, turning her into a pitiful, sick, fragile woman to justify his actions and seduce the other. He was using false nobility to cover the lowest of scoundrel behaviors. As if to add a final layer of humiliation, the young woman giggled and added, "Also, right, girl, I wear him out so much in bed when we meet that there's no energy left for anything else. He gets home wiped out, dying to escape again, counts the hours to see me." Each sentence was a blow, a hammer breaking the statue of her marriage, her husband, herself. The woman she thought she was, strong, loved, a life partner, was being deconstructed, word by word, and replaced by a pathetic, sick figure. The pain was so intense, it became physical, a crushing pressure in her chest. She held the coffee cup, the cold porcelain against her trembling fingers, and looked at the dark liquid. There, in the distorted reflection, she no longer saw the woman who entered that cafe. She saw a stranger, a fool, a victim. And the only thing keeping her from crumbling was the cold flame of rage beginning to burn in place of her broken heart. She wouldn't cry. Not there. The pain was immense, but the need for one final confirmation, one last nail in the coffin, was even greater. She didn't cry. The tears seemed frozen at their source. The sob that had threatened to rise was now petrified in her chest. There was a terrible clarity in her mind, the clarity that precedes a storm. She needed one last thing. A final, irrefutable proof. A confession from the traitor's own mouth, or rather his fingers. With surprisingly steady hands, she took her phone from her purse. The device, which she'd used so many times to exchange affectionate messages and daily trivialities with James, now felt like a weapon. Her fingers slid over the cold screen, opening the messaging app. His photo smiled at her from the top of the conversation, an image from past vacations, sun on his face, the sea in the background. A happiness that now seemed an elaborate farce. She breathed deeply, the air entering and exiting her lungs mechanically, without life. And then, she typed. Each letter was a small act of courage and self-destruction. "Babe, is your meeting in Orlando tonight still on?" The word babe was the hardest to write. It sounded like a lie from her own fingers, a relic from a time that had just died. She hit send, and the small blue bubble with her question floated to the top of the screen. Delivered. The bait was in the water. She set the phone on the table, screen up, and waited. Time in the cafe seemed to warp. Seconds dragged like minutes. The sound of the mistress's laughter at the next table was auditory torture. Savannah didn't dare look at them. Her eyes were glued to her phone's dark screen, waiting for it to light up. A tiny, masochistic part of her, the last foolish spark of hope, prayed he'd reply, "Meeting cancelled. Heading home, hun." Or anything else that could, by a miracle, debunk the nightmare she was living. Then the screen lit up. The name James glowed, followed by a new message notification. Savannah's heart gave a painful leap. It was the moment of truth, the verdict. She swiped her finger across the screen, her breath caught in her throat. The message appeared. "Yeah, totally confirmed. A drag, but necessary. But I'll be home early tomorrow. And hey, I won't even go to work tomorrow. We can jumpstart and head to our weekend in the Florida Keys like you suggested. What do you think?" The confirmation. The blatant lie. And the final touch of cruelty. Using her plan, her dream of reigniting the marriage, as a pat on the back to soothe the sick and needy wife at home while he prepared to meet the other. It was the end, the last tiny ember of hope extinguished, leaving only cold ashes. No more doubt, no more denial. Just the naked, raw, ugly truth. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was a complex web of lies, disrespect, and humiliation. He wasn't just sleeping with another woman, he was destroying Savannah's image for her. She read the message again, and again. His words, so casual, so affectionate on the surface, were the definitive proof. The cruel test was over, and she had the result in hand. A heavy silence settled in her soul. The shock gave way to something new, something hard, sharp, and unbreakable. The pain was still there, a black hole in her chest, but around that hole, a new Savannah began to form. And this new woman wouldn't cry. She would act. The only question left was, how? At the next table, the young women's conversation was wrapping up. The mistress glanced at the watch on her wrist, a flashy gold model that Savannah imagined bitterly had been a gift. "He should be here any minute," the girl said, her voice full of an excitement that now sounded obscene to Savannah's ears. "Girl, I gotta go. Movie, and then pure bliss." She winked at the other. "Tomorrow I'll tell you everything, with details." The two stood up, laughing. Savannah remained still, her face still partially hidden by the menu, watching them say goodbye with a hug. The friend went one way while the mistress stayed there near the cafe, fiddling with her phone with an anticipatory smile. She was waiting for James, waiting for Savannah's husband. A plan began to form in Savannah's mind, not a plan for cheap revenge, but for dignity. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. She would watch. She would witness with her own eyes the final scene of that farce. With precise, deliberate movements, she signaled the waiter. When he arrived, she pointed to the bill, paid with her card via tap, all without a word. She stood and left the cafe, walking in the opposite direction from where the mistress waited, blending into the crowd. She found the perfect spot, the front of a store across the corridor, where shadows and the flow of people made her practically invisible. From there she had a clear, unobstructed view of the staged scene, and then she saw him. James. He came from the main corridor, his familiar stride the dress shirt she'd handed him that morning. To anyone else he was just another businessman strolling through the mall. To Savannah, he was the embodiment of her pain. He looked around, a discreet scan of someone checking if the coast was clear. Savannah's heart beat once, strong and heavy. It was him. The last, tiniest particle of denial turned to dust. He approached the mistress. Her smile opened wide, radiant. He, however, was more restrained. He cast a quick glance around before leaning in and giving her a hug. It wasn't a passionate lover's embrace in public, but something quick, almost furtive, a contact that lasted a second longer than socially acceptable, a hug that, to an attentive observer, betrayed an intimacy they were trying to hide. Savannah watched it all, motionless. She didn't feel the urge to scream, to run over, to tear that woman away from him. She felt only a profound detachment, as if watching a scene from a movie about someone else's life. The choreography of the lie continued. They exchanged a few quick words, complicit smiles. Then, James stepped away from her. With a discreet nod, he left the front of the cafe and began walking alone toward the cinema area. He didn't look back. The mistress waited a few moments, the calculated time for the distance between them to grow, and then started following in the same direction, keeping a safe space between her and James. Two strangers to the world, heading to the same secret destination. They thought they were clever. They thought they were discreet. Little did they know their play had a spectator in the front row. And that spectator, the betrayed wife, the woman who should be at home, sick and oblivious to everything, was about to buy her own ticket to the final act. The meeting in Orlando was about to have a surprise participant. Savannah followed them, maintaining the same safe distance they kept from each other. With each step toward the cinema, her rage solidified, turning into a diamond-hard resolution. She was no longer a passive victim, she was a hunter. The cinema area was darker, lit by the pulsing glow of LED screens advertising the movies. James stopped at the self-service kiosk line, looking at the options like any customer. The mistress, meanwhile, pretended to study the movie posters, keeping a distance that seemed casual. Savannah watched from behind a pillar, her heart beating in a slow, heavy rhythm. She saw James buy 2 tickets. Then he moved away from the kiosk and stopped near the entrance, as if waiting for someone. That's when their little theatrical piece continued. The mistress finished looking at the posters and started walking toward him. In a movement that seemed like a choreographed accident, she bumped into him. In that brief instant of physical contact, Savannah saw something that made her clench her fists. She saw his hand quickly and almost imperceptibly slip some cash into hers, a payment, a transaction. He was funding his own secret rendezvous. With the money in hand, the mistress stepped away from him and ordered a large bucket of popcorn and 2 sodas, laughing with the attendant as if it were the happiest day of her life. James waited, pretending to be impatient, glancing at his watch. When she returned with the snacks, they finally joined up. Far enough from the ticket area to feel safe, the discretion farce was dropped. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned her head close to him, whispering something that made him laugh. They entered the corridor leading to the screening rooms, laughing like 2 teenagers on their first forbidden date. Savannah observed everything, every gesture, every smile, every lie. She saw the number of the room they entered, Theater 5, VIP. The irony was cruel. He was taking her to a luxury screening, with reclining seats and exclusive service, while lying to his wife about a boring work meeting. The corridor emptied. The sound of their laughter vanished behind the door. Savannah stood for a long moment, the silence around her contrasting with the storm in her soul. She breathed deeply, once, twice. The air seemed heavy, hard to inhale. There was no turning back. Their story, their marriage, would end there, in that dark movie theater. With a calm that frightened her, she walked to the ticket counter. "1 ticket for Theater 5, please," she said to the attendant, her voice firm, without a hint of hesitation. She didn't even know what the movie was. Ticket in hand, she didn't enter immediately. She didn't want them to see her during the previews under the partial light of the room. She would wait for the perfect moment. The moment when the lights went out completely, when they were comfortable, relaxed in their nest of lies, absorbed in the movie and each other. She sat on a bench in the corridor, the ticket cold in her hand, and waited. Each passing minute was one more for her pain to transform into strength. She wasn't the betrayed wife who would make a scandal. She was the director of that drama's final scene, and the climax, she promised herself, would be unforgettable. When the corridor lights flickered, signaling the movie's start, she stood. Her heart no longer beat with panic, but with the steady pulse of someone about to execute an act of personal justice. She handed the ticket to the usher and entered Theatre 5. The darkness was almost total, broken only by the glow of the giant screen where previews were beginning. The sound was loud, immersive. The leather seats, wide and reclining, were arranged in pairs, creating small islands of privacy. It was easy to spot them. In the second-to-last row, in the most isolated corner, two silhouettes were closer than the others. Savannah walked slowly over the carpet, her steps muffled by the movie sound. She didn't approach from behind. She circled via the front row, climbing the side steps until she was at their level, but coming from the side. She wanted them to see her face when the time came. There they were. The mistress's head rested on James's shoulder. His arm wrapped around her, their fingers intertwined over the popcorn bucket between them. They were intimate, relaxed, living the fullness of their lie in the luxurious comfort of the VIP theater. They were the perfect image of a couple in love, a stolen image built on her humiliation. Savannah waited for the exact moment. A noisy preview ended, and in the brief second of silence before the next began, she acted. She took the two final steps separating her from them, and with a calm that would freeze hell, extended her hand and lightly touched James's shoulder. He turned, annoyed by the interruption, his face ready to dismiss a stranger. But the face he saw wasn't a stranger's. It was his wife's. James's eyes widened. The color drained from his face, leaving a cadaverous pallor under the screen's light. The mistress, sensing the sudden tension, lifted her head, her smile dying on her lips as she followed his terrified gaze. Savannah looked deep into the eyes of the man who had once been her world. There was no hate in her gaze, no tears. There was only a cold void and an unshakable firmness. And then she uttered the words she'd rehearsed in her mind, her voice clear and cutting, overriding the start of the next preview's music. And the meeting. Is it still tonight? The silence that followed in their little bubble was heavier than any scream. James paled, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The mistress froze, her face a mask of panic and shock, finally understanding who the crazy wife was. Savannah didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. She turned her back on them, and with the same dignity she'd entered, walked to the exit, leaving behind the man who had just lost everything in the exact moment he thought he had the world in his hands. He followed her, of course. Desperate, he caught up to her in the lit corridor. "Savannah, wait, it's not what you think." She stopped and turned to him, her face impassive. Her gaze shifted from him for a moment, scanning the other empty seats in the theater they'd left, and then returned to his face. "Really?" she said, her voice laced with cutting irony. "The theater's pretty full. Must be why you two were all over each other like that. No other seats." There was no excuse, no way out. In her hand, she still held the cinema receipt. She crumpled it hard, turning it into a small ball of paper, and then, in a final gesture of contempt, she threw the crumpled paper at his chest. "It's over, James." And she left. She didn't run. She walked. Each step took her away from the past and toward an uncertain but her own future. She didn't want to hear from him anymore. When he called, she didn't answer. When he begged, she filed for divorce. He regretted it, of course. Regret is the faithful companion of those who get caught. The young mistress for a while kept pursuing him. He, lost and humiliated, gave in. She made him feel like a man, potent, desired, but the adrenaline of the forbidden was gone. What remained was an empty shell. Her shallowness, once exciting, became boring. The conversation was superficial, the interests non-existent. He found himself bored and, for the first time, profoundly alone. Meanwhile, Savannah blossomed. With the separation, she accepted Emily's invitation and went to stay for a while in her daughter's apartment. The young woman, who felt lonely with her heavy study routine, loved having her mom around, a support network, a friend. They cooked together, watched movies, talked for hours. Savannah rediscovered joy in her daughter's company, and Emily rediscovered her mother's strength. During college break, they packed their bags. With the divorce settlement money, they decided to fulfill an old dream, a trip through Europe, just the two of them. It was days of pure happiness. Pasta in Rome, strolls in Paris, sunsets in Lisbon. James, in his empty and silent house, saw it all through his daughter's social media. He saw photos of Savannah smiling in front of the Colosseum, her face lighter, younger. He saw the sparkle in her eyes in a video, toasting with wine at a Parisian cafe. And in every smile, every landscape, he saw the reflection of the world he'd lost. Not because of a meeting in Orlando, but because of the stupid choice he'd made in his life. He lost the woman of his life, and she, by losing him, found herself. Savannah's story is about the pain of betrayal, but above all, it's about the strength we find when our world crumbles. It's about the courage to choose yourself, even when your heart is in pieces. It's proof that the end of a chapter isn't the end of the book, but a chance to write a new beginning, much more beautiful and true. And if this message touched your heart deeply, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Right down below, you'll find the Super Thanks button. Clicking it is a gesture of support that helps us keep this mission alive of bringing stories that heal, that give strength, and that show there's always, always a path to bloom. Thanks for watching and for being part of our channel, and a super thanks to everyone who chooses to support. Until the next story.